Good evening. On an ordinary Saturday morning, somewhere in suburban America, a man pushes a shopping cart through the outdoor aisles of a garden center. He is not looking for anything unusual. A bag of potting soil perhaps, a pair of gardening gloves, maybe some climbing vines to cover the old wooden fence before summer arrives. Around him, families drift quietly between rows of flowers. Children point at bright blooms. Someone loads tomato plants into the trunk of a car. It is one of the most ordinary places imaginable. And yet, only a few feet away, hanging from a metal rack with a small plastic price tag, is a plant whose seeds contain one of the oldest naturally occurring psychedelic compounds known to science, perfectly legal to buy, perfectly legal to grow, available by the hundreds in garden centers across America, sitting between the herb kits and the marigolds. No locked cabinet, no prescription, no pharmacist, no age verification, no suspicious exchange in a dark alley, just flowers. Most people walk past them without a second glance. The ones who know what they are see something entirely different. Inside those small, unremarkable seeds is a chemical called lysergic acid amide, LSA, a close natural relative of the compound, that in laboratories and newspaper headlines became LSD. The experience it produces is slower, heavier, often darker, but the family resemblance is unmistakable. For centuries, these seeds were treated as sacred by priests in the mist-covered mountains of southern Mexico. 400 years later, they would become an unlikely curiosity of modern drug culture, sold openly under the guise of ornamental gardening. How could a naturally occurring psychedelic remain legal while nearly everything related to it became prohibited? The answer begins thousands of years before the first garden center ever existed. Before we continue, if these quiet journeys through forgotten corners of history help you unwind, consider leaving a like and subscribing before you settle in for the night. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from. I always find it remarkable to see how far these stories travel. Now then, dim the lights a little more. Set your phone face down. And let us begin in the mountains of Oaxaca, where a small flowering vine was already changing human consciousness long before the modern world had words for what it was doing. The mountains of Oaxaca rise steeply out of the dry Mexican lowlands, reaching into altitudes where the air turns thin and the mornings carry a cold that surprises you regardless of the season. The terrain is fractured and difficult. Deep valleys cutting between ridgelines, villages clinging to slopes at angles that seem to defy gravity, forest giving way to cloud and then forest again. For most of human history, this geography functioned as a kind of preservation. Things that entered the mountains tended to stay there. People who settled in the high valleys developed their own languages, their own calendars, their own relationships with the plants that grew around them. They were not isolated from the world so much as insulated from it. It is here, long before the concept of a controlled substance existed, long before Swiss laboratories and federal drug schedules and garden center retail displays, that this story actually begins. The civilization that would come to dominate central Mexico, the people history would know as the Aztecs, who called themselves the Mexica, did not experience the world in the way we are accustomed to. This is not a romantic oversimplification. It is a structural fact about how their society was organized. For the Mexica and the cultures that surrounded them, the universe was not a stable, predictable place that ran quietly in the background while human beings went about their days. It was an active negotiation, a constant, precarious transaction between the human world and forces that were vast, unpredictable, and required careful management. The gods did not simply exist. They had to be maintained, and they communicated back, but not in ways that ordinary perception could access. This is why the role of the priest, the Teopixqui, was not a ceremonial position in the modern sense. The word Teopixqui translates roughly as guardian of the divine, but the weight of that responsibility was entirely literal. These were not men who performed symbolic rituals at a safe remove from the forces they invoked. They were intermediaries, professional crossers of the boundary between the visible world and whatever lay on the other side of it. And crossing that boundary required tools. Among the most sacred of those tools was a vine. It grew wild across the highlands of Oaxaca and the valleys surrounding what is now Mexico City. It was a climbing plant, aggressive in the way all members of its family tend to be, twisting along walls and trees and fence posts with a kind of patient determination. It produced flowers, small, white, trumpet-shaped, that opened in the morning and closed by midday, as though they had decided the afternoon was not worth their attention. The seeds it produced were brown, small, and entirely unremarkable to the untrained eye. Nobody looking at them on a market table would suspect they contained anything unusual. Nothing about their appearance gave anything away. The Nahuatl-speaking peoples called these seeds ololiuqui. The word means simply round thing. It refers to the shape of the seed itself, a practical, almost dismissive name for something that was, in practice, treated with the kind of reverence other cultures reserved for their most sacred texts. Ololiuqui was not consumed casually. It was not a recreational substance in any sense that the modern world would recognize. It was medicine. It was interrogation. It was a door, opened only when there was something specific that needed to be found on the other side. The ritual of ololiuqui, as documented by later Spanish observers and eventually reconstructed by modern ethnobotanists, followed a consistent pattern. The Teopixqui, or in some accounts, a specialized healer called a curandero, would receive a question: where is the stolen object? Which of the household's enemies is working sorcery against them? What illness is causing the patient's suffering, and what plant will cure it? These were not metaphysical questions asked in the abstract. They were practical problems requiring answers that would have real consequences. The priest was expected to produce those answers. The preparation of the seeds was careful and deliberate. They were ground into a fine powder using stone mortars, a process that would have released their compounds slowly into the surface of the grinding stone, that would have left a faint residue of something on the hands of the person preparing them. The resulting powder was dissolved in water or in pulque, the fermented drink made from the agave plant that served as both social lubricant and ceremonial sacrament throughout Mesoamerican culture. The liquid was then consumed, typically at night, typically by a single individual seeking the answer to a specific question, in a space that had been prepared for the purpose. What followed was not the experience of a modern psychedelic as popular culture tends to imagine it. There were no reports of bright geometric visions, no descriptions of kaleidoscopic light, no accounts of the kind of expansive, energized perception that would later be associated with LSD in the laboratories and lecture halls of the 20th century. What the priests described, what the Spanish observers noted with a mixture of fascination and alarm, was something closer to a heavy, drowsy, enveloping trance, a state that settled over the consciousness the way deep water settles over something submerged. Gravity intensified. The body became an object of indifference. The boundary between sleep and waking lost its usual definition. And in that borderland, the answers arrived. They came, according to the accounts that survived, as communications from the entities the priests believed they were consulting, the gods, the forces, the presences that existed on the other side of ordinary perception. Whether those communications were genuine visitations or the mind's own production, reorganized by the chemistry of the seed and presented as external contact, is a question that cannot be answered from this distance. What can be said is that the priests took the information seriously. They acted on it. They diagnosed illnesses from the visions. They located stolen objects. They identified enemies. And whether through the accuracy of their answers or the authority of their position, communities trusted them. It is worth pausing on this for a moment. The Aztec use of ololiuqui was not a culture of excess. It was not a practice oriented toward pleasure or toward escape or toward the kind of altered experience that people in other eras have sought, simply because altered experience is interesting. The seeds were taken in the performance of a serious professional function. They were taken in service of the community's most pressing anxieties: illness, theft, conflict, the invisible machinations of enemies. The Teopixqui who consumed ololiuqui was doing something closer to what we would call diagnostic work than to what we would call getting high. This distinction matters because it shapes the entire subsequent history of the plant. The seeds were not abandoned when things became difficult. They were hidden, protected, passed down through channels that the authorities of successive eras could never quite seal off. The reverence with which they were treated was not the reverence of recreation. It was the reverence of necessity. And things that are necessary tend to survive. The vine itself, meanwhile, continued to do what it had always done. It climbed, it flowered, it dropped its small brown seeds onto the soil of the highlands, and the highlands kept them, and the seeds waited for whatever came next. Beyond the rituals of divination and diagnosis, ololiuqui occupied a specific place in Aztec medical understanding that the Spanish would later struggle to categorize. For the Mexica, the distinction between spiritual and physical illness was not clear in the way it would be for a European physician of the same era. A sickness of the body could have its cause in the spirit world. A conflict with an enemy could manifest as physical deterioration. The correct response to any ailment, therefore, required both a physical treatment, a plant preparation, a diet, a procedure, and a spiritual investigation into the cause. Ololiuqui served both functions. It was the investigative instrument. It revealed the source of the problem. The treatment followed from what the investigation showed. The specific plant involved in these rituals, the vine called ololiuqui, was Turbina corymbosa, also known as Rivea corymbosa. A related species, Ipomoea tricolor, was used as well, and the Nahuatl-speaking priests called it Tilitliltzin. Both are members of the family Convolvulaceae. Both produce seeds that contain the same family of chemical compounds. Both are climbing vines with trumpet-shaped flowers that open in the morning and close by afternoon. Both would, centuries later, be sold in identical paper packets from the same metal racks in the same suburban garden centers, described on their labels simply as morning glory, the morning glory. The cheerful, sprawling, undemanding ornamental vine, that thousands of people plant along fences and trellises every spring, prized for the vivid blue and purple of its flowers, entirely unremarkable in every direction except one, the one that no label mentions. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In the final years before European contact, the sacred vine grew in its mountains and its valleys. The priests who used it were part of a system of knowledge that had been accumulating, refining, and transmitting itself for generations, possibly centuries. The specifics of preparation, the proper setting, the right questions to ask, the correct interpretation of what arrived during the trance, all of this was institutional knowledge, held by trained practitioners, passed from teacher to student in the way that all serious professional knowledge gets passed on. That system was about to encounter something it had no category for. In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of what is now Veracruz with approximately 500 men, a handful of horses, and ambitions that the Aztec Empire had not yet learned to properly assess. By 1521, Tenochtitlan, the great city at the center of the Aztec world, built on an island in the middle of a lake, with aqueducts and causeways and a population larger than any city then existing in Europe, had fallen. What would follow for the plants and for the people who used them was something the mountains of Oaxaca would feel for the next 400 years. The vine kept growing, the seeds kept falling, but the world in which they had always been understood was about to be systematically dismantled, piece by piece, until almost nothing remained. Almost. The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 was not simply a military event. It is tempting, from the distance of 5 centuries, to describe it in the language of conquest. One power defeating another, a flag changing, an administration replaced. But what actually occurred was something closer to a cosmological collapse. The Aztec world was not organized around political authority in the way European societies understood political authority. It was organized around a total vision of reality, a universe with specific requirements, specific forces, specific channels through which those forces communicated with human beings. When the Spanish dismantled the temples, burned the codices, and executed or converted the priestly class, they were not simply changing the government. They were attempting to erase an entire way of understanding what the world was. They did not succeed entirely, but they came closer than is comfortable to acknowledge. The destruction of the Aztec library, the codices, the painted books that recorded everything from astronomical observations to agricultural calendars to the specific protocols of religious ceremony, was systematic and deliberate. The most famous act of destruction belongs to Bishop Juan de Zumárraga, who reportedly oversaw the burning of thousands of manuscripts in the market square of Tlatelolco in 1529, just 8 years after the conquest. Zumárraga himself would later express some ambivalence about the completeness of that destruction. What had been lost, he understood, could not be recovered. The knowledge was gone. But the practice was not. The burning did not end the tradition. It severed the written record that might have allowed outsiders to understand it, which is a different thing entirely. Among the things that vanished into those fires or went underground in the years that followed was the formal institutional knowledge surrounding Ololiuqui, the Teopixqui, the priestly intermediaries who had maintained the tradition, who had trained in the proper use of the seeds, who understood the specific context in which the vine's effects could be navigated, were either converted, executed, or driven into the remote mountain communities where the Spanish presence was thinner and the long arm of colonial authority moved more slowly. This is not a metaphor. The mountains of Oaxaca, the same steep terrain described at the opening of this story, functioned as literal refuge. The Mazatec, Zapotec, Chinantec, and Mixtec communities in the high valleys had been peripheral to the Aztec Empire. They remained peripheral to the Spanish one. Their remoteness, which had always been a limitation in some practical senses, became in this period their most valuable quality. Distance from the colonial centers meant distance from the Inquisition. The Inquisition arrived formally in New Spain in 1571, when King Philip II authorized the establishment of a tribunal in Mexico City. It had, in practice, been operating through the missionary orders for decades before that. Its particular concern, in the context of the indigenous population, was the persistence of what the Church called idolatry, the continuation of pre-Christian religious practice under the surface of nominal conversion. And psychoactive plants occupied a special category in the Church's understanding of that problem. Ololiuqui was identified specifically. The seeds, the Spanish clergy recognized, were not merely a cultural habit or a social tradition. They were a mechanism. They opened something, and what they opened in the Church's framework was not a channel to the divine, because the divine, as the Church understood it, did not communicate through seeds and trances in mountain villages. What they opened was something else, something the Church had a very specific name for: the confession records from colonial New Spain, the documents produced when indigenous parishioners were interrogated about their continued practices, contain repeated references to the seeds. Parishioners described the visions that arrived during Ololiuqui ceremonies. They described the communications they received. They described the entities they encountered in the trance state. To a Spanish inquisitor in the 16th century, the vocabulary of those descriptions confirmed exactly what he feared. This was not medicine. This was commerce with demons. The Church's response was to prohibit the practice and punish those who continued it. Penalties ranged from public humiliation to imprisonment, to, in the more extreme cases, flogging. The seeds were to be destroyed. The ceremonies were to cease. The priests who facilitated them were to convert or face the consequences. And yet, the vine kept growing. This is the first fact about Ololiuqui that the Spanish were never quite able to absorb. The plant did not require human cultivation to survive. It grew in the wild. It grew on hillsides and in valley margins and along the edges of fields. You could burn the seeds that had been collected and stored. You could arrest the healer who had administered them. You could find the family that had requested the ceremony. But you could not burn a hillside. You could not arrest a vine. The supply was inexhaustible, and the demand, rooted in centuries of genuine belief in the seed's efficacy, did not simply evaporate because a new authority arrived and declared it illegal. What the Inquisition actually accomplished was not eradication. It was concealment. The practice did not end. It went deeper into the mountains. It continued in the communities most insulated from colonial oversight. It became something passed between trusted people in private, stripped of the public, institutional dimension it had once carried, but preserved in its essential form: the seeds, the preparation, the specific questions, the nighttime trance. Into this landscape of suppressed knowledge and underground continuity, in the year 1570, walked a Spanish physician named Francisco Hernandez. Hernandez was not a conquistador. He was not a priest. He was the personal physician to Philip II of Spain, a man of science, trained in the empirical tradition of Renaissance medicine, dispatched by the king on the first European state-sponsored scientific expedition to the Americas. His instructions were specific: travel through New Spain, document its plants and animals, catalog their medicinal properties, and return with a comprehensive natural history of a continent that Europe had barely begun to understand. The king spent 60,000 ducats on the mission, enough at the time to finance a small army for a year. He expected something extraordinary in return. What Hernandez found over the 7 years he spent traveling through Mexico between 1570 and 1577 was a botanical world of extraordinary richness and complexity. He catalogued somewhere in the region of 3,000 plant species. He interviewed indigenous healers through translators about the properties and applications of the plants they used. He observed medical practices that had no equivalents in European medicine. And in the course of that work, he encountered the vine the priests had been using for generations. He described it in his notes with the careful, measured language of a physician who is trying to record something accurately, without letting his own reaction to it contaminate the record. He noted the appearance of the plant. He noted the name the indigenous people used for it. He noted the specific context in which the seeds were consumed by priests at night for the purpose of receiving communications from entities they regarded as divine. He noted the effects: a heavy, drowsy, delirium-adjacent state characterized by visions and an apparent suspension of ordinary cognition. He was concerned by what he was documenting. He was also, in the way that scientists of genuine curiosity tend to be, deeply interested in it. His account of Ololiuqui is one of the earliest and most detailed European descriptions of a psychedelic plant used in ceremonial context. It contains enough information that later researchers, working centuries afterward, would be able to use it as a starting point for finding the plant and the practice again. In that sense, Hernandez inadvertently became a kind of time capsule. He wrote down what he saw, and what he wrote down survived, at least in part, when so much else was lost. At least in part. The manuscripts that Hernandez carried back to Spain in 1577 were, by any measure, one of the most significant scientific documents of the era. They represented years of fieldwork across an entire continent. They contained descriptions and illustrations of thousands of species that European science had never formally encountered. King Philip II, who had funded the expedition and was presumably eager to see what his 60,000 ducats had produced, received the manuscripts and proceeded to do almost nothing with them. The reasons for this are partly bureaucratic and partly political. Hernandez himself died in 1587 without seeing his complete work published. A condensed version was prepared by a court physician named Nardo Antonio Recci, and a partial publication eventually appeared in Rome in 1651, more than 70 years after Hernandez returned from Mexico. The full manuscript, stored in the Escorial Palace Library outside Madrid, was partially destroyed in a fire in 1671. Some portions survived, others were gone. What this meant for the knowledge of Ololiuqui was that the first serious European scientific account of the plant, the one document that might have connected the seeds of a Mexican vine to a broader Western understanding of psychoactive plants, was buried, delayed, censored by anxiety about what the Inquisition might make of it, and then partially consumed by fire. The vine had survived the conquest. The written knowledge of the vine very nearly did not. For the next several centuries, Ololiuqui occupied a peculiar position in Western awareness. It was not unknown. Fragments of colonial documentation survived. References appeared in various accounts of New World plants, and the indigenous communities who used the seeds continued to do so in their mountain villages. But it was not understood. The specific chemistry of the seeds was a complete mystery. The botanical identity of the plant had been muddled by the imprecision of early colonial descriptions, and the colonial authorities had done such an effective job of driving the practice underground that by the 19th century, Western botanists were not even certain which plant the historical sources were referring to. The vine grew on in the mountains. The Mazatec, Zapotec, and Mixtec communities maintained their relationship with the seeds through generation after generation of careful transmission, holding the knowledge the way you hold anything that someone powerful wants to take from you. Close, quiet, and unremarked upon in the presence of strangers. And then, slowly, the strangers started asking different questions. By the late 19th century, the field of ethnobotany, the scientific study of the relationships between human cultures and the plants they use, was beginning to take seriously the idea that indigenous knowledge about psychoactive plants might be worth documenting before the last people who held it were gone. The assumption behind this impulse was not entirely uncomplicated. It carried with it the condescensions of its era, the sense that these traditions were dying, that the people who held them were artifacts of a fading world, that the role of the scientist was to arrive and record before everything disappeared. The impulse was partly extractive in its structure, but it produced results that nothing else had produced. In 1897, a Mexican botanist named M. Urbina made a significant contribution to the puzzle. He formally identified the plant that historical sources had called Ololiuqui as Rivea corymbosa, a species of morning glory. The botanical identity of the vine was, for the first time, clear. But the chemical identity of whatever was inside the seeds, the compound or compounds that produced the divination trance, remained completely unknown. Knowing the plant's name did not explain its mechanism. It did not explain what the priests had actually been experiencing in those nighttime ceremonies. It did not explain why the seeds worked at all. That question would take another 40 years to answer, and the person who would eventually answer it would not be looking for Ololiuqui. He would be looking for something else entirely, something that, when he found it, would send him on a trajectory that would eventually lead him to seeds on a rack in a garden center, staring at a compound that should not by any reasonable expectation have been there. But that part of the story belongs to a different country and a different century and a very particular afternoon in Basel, Switzerland, that began with a bicycle. There is a particular kind of scientist who does not fit comfortably inside the institutions that produce him. Richard Evans. Schultes was not that kind of scientist. He was, in almost every outward respect, precisely what Harvard in the late 1930s was designed to produce. Measured, rigorous, formally dressed, committed to the protocols of empirical botany with a seriousness that verged on the devotional. He published his findings in careful, precisely worded academic papers. He maintained a lifelong loyalty to his university, his church, and his family. He was, by all accounts, the kind of man who found the drug culture of the 1960s, which would later claim him as a founding patron without his consent, faintly ridiculous. when Timothy Leary, his Harvard colleague and the era's most prominent evangelist for psychedelic experience, described an LSD trip as an earth-shaking metaphysical revelation, Schultes is reported to have responded with something close to impatience. "That's funny, Bill," he told William Burroughs on a separate occasion, after Burroughs had offered a similarly expansive description of a psychedelic encounter. "All I saw was colors." Schultes was not uninterested in what the plants he studied actually did. He was not squeamish about the subject matter, but he was interested in the plants themselves, in their taxonomy, their chemistry, their cultural context, their deep history. The experience of consuming them was, for him, data. Not revelation, not transformation, data. This disposition, rigorous, unhurried, oriented toward the plant rather than towards the self, made him exactly the right person to do what nobody else had yet managed to do. Go to Oaxaca, find the communities that still used Ololiuqui, and document what was actually happening there. He was 23 years old when he first arrived in Oaxaca in 1937. He was a doctoral student at Harvard, working under the botanist Oakes Ames, and his thesis project was audacious in the way that only a certain kind of young scholar's project can be. He intended to track down and identify the lost botanical sources of two Aztec sacred narcotics that colonial-era accounts had described, but that no modern scientist had ever formally confirmed. One was Teonanacatl, the mushrooms the Aztecs called the flesh of the gods. The other was Ololiuqui. He was working from fragments. The colonial documentation, pieces of Hernandez's account, references in the writings of various Spanish missionaries, second-hand descriptions filtered through the alarm and incomprehension of 16th-century Catholic observers, was imprecise enough that serious scholars had spent decades arguing about whether the plants in question were even real, or whether the Spanish sources had confused multiple plants with one another, or whether the effects described were the products of imagination and superstition rather than genuine pharmacological action. The skepticism was not unreasonable. Working from 400-year-old documents describing ceremonies that the authors themselves had not participated in, translated twice, and filtered through a worldview that regarded the entire practice as demonic, was not an ideal evidential foundation. Schultes went anyway. What he found in the mountains of Oaxaca was not what the skeptics had predicted. The Mazatec communities he visited were not holding on to a degraded memory of something that had once existed. They were practicing. The ceremonies were alive. The healers, the curanderos, who had, over the generations since the Conquest, absorbed and adapted the older priestly tradition, were still using the seeds, still preparing them, still asking the same categories of questions that the Teopixki had asked in the years before Cortés arrived. The mountain communities had maintained a continuity that no external authority had been able to break. Not the Spanish Inquisition, not 4 centuries of colonial and post-colonial pressure, not the nominal Christianity that had been layered over indigenous practice without ever fully displacing what lay beneath it. He collected specimens. He documented the preparation methods. He observed what he could observe as an outsider who was present by permission rather than by immersion. And he confirmed for the first time in the scientific record that Ololiuqui was not a historical artifact. It was a living practice, conducted by living people in the same mountains where it had always been conducted. His identification of the source plant built on the work that Urbina had done 40 years earlier. The vine that the Aztec healers used was Turbina corymbosa, also known as Rivea corymbosa. The same species, Urbina, had tentatively identified from historical sources in 1897. Schultes confirmed the identification from direct botanical observation, collecting specimens of the plant in the field and cross-referencing them against the colonial descriptions with the precision that his training demanded. A related species, Ipomoea tricolor, was also in use, the one the Nahuatl-speaking communities had historically called Tlitliltzin. Schultes documented that one too. In 1941, he completed his PhD dissertation. It formally identified Ololiuki and the magic mushrooms as real plants used in real ceremonies by real people, and it placed both within a rigorous botanical and anthropological framework that the skeptics could not easily dismiss. It was, by the standards of academic botany, a significant achievement. It was also, in a broader sense, an act of recovery, the scientific equivalent of finding something that had been buried and bringing it back to a place where it could be seen. But the dissertation answered only half the question. Schultes knew what the plant was. He knew what it was used for. He knew something about the subjective experience it produced, the heavy, drowsy, trance-adjacent state that the colonial sources had described, and that the Mazatec curanderos confirmed in their own terms. What he did not know, and what his botanical training could not tell him, was why. What chemical compound inside those small brown seeds produced an effect that the people who consumed them described as contact with the divine? What was actually happening in the brain and body of a Teopixqui entering his nighttime trance? What was the mechanism? That question required a chemist, and the chemist who would eventually answer it was, in 1941, still years away from asking it. He had just made a discovery of his own, an accidental one in a laboratory in Switzerland. That would change the course of pharmacological history and eventually send him on a collision course with the ancient vine. His name was Albert Hofmann. Hofmann had been working at Sandoz Laboratories in Basel since 1929, employed in the Pharmaceutical Research Division that was then engaged in a systematic investigation of ergot alkaloids, the chemical compounds produced by the fungus Claviceps purpurea, which grows parasitically on rye and other grains. Ergot had been known for centuries as a source of both medicine and catastrophe. In the Middle Ages, communities that ate bread made from ergot-contaminated rye experienced mass episodes of convulsions, hallucinations, and gangrene, a condition known as St. Anthony's Fire, which killed tens of thousands of people across Europe before its cause was identified. But ergot also contained compounds that were medically useful. Ergotamine, isolated in the early 20th century, became an important treatment for migraines. The pharmaceutical potential of the ergot family was real, and Sandoz was methodically working through its chemistry, synthesizing derivatives and testing their effects. In 1938, in the process of working through this series, Hofmann synthesized his 25th compound in a chain of lysergic acid derivatives. He named it, according to the notation system he was using, LSD-25, from the German Lysergsäure diethylamide, lysergic acid diethylamide. He noted some unusual pharmacological properties in the preliminary animal testing. The test mice appeared restless. And then, because the compound did not produce the cardiovascular effects that were the main focus of the Sandoz research program at the time, he set it aside. It sat on the shelf for 5 years. In April 1943, Hofmann returned to LSD-25. He wanted to re-examine it. He was not sure why exactly. He described later a kind of intuition that the compound was worth looking at more carefully. While working with a small amount of the material, he inadvertently absorbed a trace quantity through his fingertips. The quantity was minuscule, enough, it would turn out, to produce a very noticeable effect. He left the laboratory. He rode his bicycle home through the streets of Basel. And somewhere during that journey, the afternoon of April 19th, 1943, a date that would become significant to people Hofmann had not yet imagined, the compound he had synthesized 5 years earlier and almost entirely forgotten announced itself. What followed was a 2-hour experience that Hofmann would spend the rest of his long life attempting to describe accurately. Intense visual phenomena, a dreamlike quality to perception, a dissolution of the ordinary boundaries between the self and the external world, an experience that was, depending on the circumstances of its occurrence, either terrifying or transcendent, or both simultaneously. He had stumbled, without planning to, onto the most powerful psychoactive compound ever synthesized by a human being. LSD-25 became LSD. Its story over the following decades is one of the most complicated in the history of pharmacology and culture, psychiatric research, Cold War experiments, the counterculture, prohibition, and a long contested argument about what the compound actually does and what it might legitimately be used for. That story is not the one we are telling tonight, but it is the context in which the next chapter of the Ololiuqui story unfolds. Because Hofmann, in the years after his bicycle ride, did not stop working. He continued his investigations into psychoactive compounds. He became particularly interested in the substances used in indigenous Mexican ceremonies. He and Richard Evans Schultes would eventually co-author a book together, Plants of the Gods, an extraordinary collaboration between the man who had walked the mountain villages and the man who had unlocked the chemistry of what grew in them. Hofmann isolated psilocybin and psilocin from the magic mushrooms that Schultes had documented. He became, in effect, the analytical chemist to Schultes's field botanist, each doing the work the other could not. And then, sometime around 1959, Hofmann received a package from Mexico. Inside, it was seeds, small, brown, unremarkable. The seeds of Turbina corymbosa. Ololiuqui, the same vine that Schultes had found, still in ceremonial use in the Aztec mountains, the same vine that Francisco Hernandez had described in his 1570 field notes. The same vine whose seeds the Teopixqui had ground into powder on stone mortars on the eve of important ceremonies for longer than any written record could establish. Someone. The accounts are not entirely clear on who, though it was connected to the ethnomycologist R. Gordon Wasson, who had been investigating Mexican psychedelic plants, had sent them to Sandoz for analysis. Hofmann took the seeds into his laboratory. He applied the same analytical methods he had used to identify psilocybin and psilocin. He worked through the chemistry carefully, isolating and characterizing the compounds present in the seeds. What he found stopped him completely. The primary psychoactive compound in Turbina corymbosa seeds was lysergic acid amide, LSA, a molecule from the same ergoline family as LSD, the same molecular skeleton that Hofmann had spent years working with, the same basic architecture that he had been building and modifying and testing since 1929. Nature had not merely produced a psychedelic compound. Nature had produced a compound that belonged to the same chemical family as the one he had spent his career synthesizing in a state-of-the-art Swiss pharmaceutical laboratory. A vine growing wild in the mountains of Oaxaca had been there first. The implications of this were significant enough that Hofmann's colleagues at Sandoz, serious scientists who had watched him work with precision and rigor for decades, initially refused to believe it. The finding was described in the accounts that survive from that period as having been met with what one source characterized as a state of disbelief, bordering on accusations of scientific fraud. Not because anyone doubted Hofmann's competence, but because the conclusion seemed impossible. Ergoline alkaloids were fungal compounds. They came from ergot. They were produced by Claviceps purpurea, the ride-dwelling fungus that Hofmann's entire research program had been built around. They did not come from a flowering vine. They did not come from something growing in the mountains of Mexico. They certainly did not come from seeds sold in garden centers. And yet, there they were. Hofmann was correct. The analysis was confirmed by other researchers. The ergoline alkaloids were real, and they were in the seeds, and the mechanism by which they came to be there, a symbiotic relationship between the vine and a fungal endophyte that colonizes its leaves and seeds, producing the alkaloids as a byproduct of that relationship, would take decades more to fully understand. But the chemical fact was established. The seeds contained LSA. The Teopixqui had been consuming ergoline alkaloids for centuries. The Spanish priests, who called the experience demonic, had been watching a neurological event driven by the same chemical family that Sandoz had been investigating for pharmaceutical applications since the 1920s. The ancient and the modern had been moving toward each other across the entirety of recorded history. In a laboratory in Basel in 1960, they finally arrived at the same point. But understanding what the compound was, what it was called, which family it belonged to, how it compared structurally to LSD, was only the beginning of the question. The harder question, the one that the Aztec priests had known the answer to experientially for centuries, but that science was only now beginning to approach from the outside, was what LSA actually did to the brain, to the body, to the person who consumed it. The answer to that question was not simple, and it was not comfortable. The question that Hofmann's discovery placed on the table in 1960 was precise and strange. The seeds of a morning glory vine contained lysergic acid amide, an ergoline alkaloid, a close structural relative of the most powerful synthetic psychedelic ever produced. The chemical family relationship was not metaphorical. It was literal. Both molecules shared the same four-ring core structure, the same basic scaffold that the ergot chemists had been working with for decades. LSD was, in chemical terms, a modification of that scaffold, a lysergic acid molecule to which Hofmann had attached a diethylamide group. LSA was the unmodified form. Nature had kept the scaffold and skipped the modification. The obvious question for anyone holding this information in the early 1960s was what LSA actually did to the person who consumed it. Not what the Aztec priests believed it did, not what the colonial chroniclers observed from the outside, but what it did, pharmacologically, neurologically, experientially, to the human mind and body. Hofmann was not the kind of scientist who answered that question theoretically if he could answer it directly. In 1947, years before the Morning Glory analysis, he had already synthesized a small quantity of LSA and administered it to himself. injecting 500 micrograms intramuscularly, the standard self-experimental method he had used to characterize the activity of other compounds. What followed was documented in clinical language. He noted the onset of nausea. He noted a heavy narcotic-like fatigue settling over both body and mind. He noted a heightened sensitivity to sound. Ordinary sounds, the ordinary noise of a laboratory, arriving with a sharpness that was disproportionate and uncomfortable. These effects developed over approximately an hour and were followed by sleep. 5 hours after administration, he reported a complete return to normal function. No residual disturbance, no afterglow. Just a return to baseline, the way a heavy blanket is removed. The clinical notes from this self-experiment contain one phrase that has been quoted in every serious subsequent discussion of the compound. Hofmann described LSA in comparison to LSD as producing effects that were predominantly sedative and narcotic in character. More depressive, more narcotic in his characterization. Not energizing, not clarifying, not the expansive, luminous, boundary-dissolving quality that his descriptions of LSD carry even through their careful scientific language. This single comparison, LSA is the heavier, darker, more narcotic version, became the foundational description of the compound in the pharmacological literature that followed, and it matched, with striking precision, what the Aztec sources had been describing for 400 years. The Teopixqui, entering his nighttime trance, was not experiencing the clean, energized alteration of perception that would later be associated with LSD. He was being pressed downward into a heavy, drowsy, gravity-amplified state in which ordinary cognition suspended itself and something else arrived. Hofmann was not the only researcher to administer LSA to human subjects in the period following its identification. A researcher named Soames, working in the mid-1950s with ergoline compounds before the morning glory connection had even been established, documented a consistent pattern across his subjects. A decrease in psychomotor activity, a feeling that participants described as sinking into nothingness, an overwhelming desire to sleep, followed by sleep itself. The phrasing is worth holding, a feeling of sinking into nothingness. This is not a recreational description. It is not the language of someone reaching for transcendence. It is the language of someone being submerged. To understand why LSA produces this specific cluster of effects, why it pulls downward rather than upward, why it sedates where LSD stimulates, why the body becomes an object of unpleasant attention rather than something that disappears from awareness, requires spending a few minutes with the pharmacology. Not in the way that pharmacology is usually presented, as a list of receptor names and numbers that exist in a vacuum, but in the way that actually illuminates what is happening. Think of the brain as operating under a continuous management system. At any given moment, your thalamus, a small structure deep in the center of the brain, roughly the size and shape of a walnut, is functioning as a relay station and a filter. Signals arrive from the outside world, from your senses, from your body, and the thalamus decides which of them to forward to the conscious, processing cortex and which to suppress. Most of what your senses detect never reaches conscious awareness. The pressure of the chair you are sitting in, the sound of distant traffic, the temperature of your own skin, the thalamus screens these out. What gets through is a curated selection of what matters right now. Serotonin, the neurotransmitter that most people associate with mood, but which has a far more complex role in brain function than the word mood suggests. is one of the key regulators of this thalamic filtering system. Serotonergic signals help calibrate what the thalamus forwards and what it suppresses. They are part of the mechanism by which the brain maintains its ordinary, bounded, manageable version of reality. Psychedelics in the lysergamide family, LSD, psilocybin, and LSA, are agonists at the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor. They bind to this receptor and activate it, mimicking the action of serotonin in ways that serotonin itself does not produce at normal physiological concentrations. The result, at the neural systems level, is a disruption of the thalamic filtering mechanism. The gate opens wider. Information that would ordinarily be suppressed before it reaches conscious awareness instead arrives at the cortex unfiltered. Sensory experience becomes denser, more intrusive, more difficult to organize into ordinary categories. The cortex, overwhelmed with input that its normal organizational frameworks were not designed to process, begins producing its own associations, images, connections, perceptions that fill the spaces between the incoming signals. This is, in mechanistic terms, what a psychedelic experience is: a disruption of the brain's editorial process, the raw material of perception arriving without the usual editorial filter. Sit with that for a moment. What the Aztec priest was experiencing in his mountain ceremony, that heavy, dreamlike state where the boundary between sleep and waking dissolved and something else arrived, was not mysticism in the way the Spanish Inquisition understood mysticism. It was the brain's gating system, opened by a compound that the vine had been producing for millennia, flooding the cortex with unfiltered input that organized itself, as the mind will, into something that felt like contact. The molecule didn't know it was being used for divination. It only knew its receptors. LSA does this. It activates the 5-HT2A receptor. It disrupts the thalamic filter. In this fundamental sense, it belongs to the same class of experiences as LSD and psilocybin. But it also does something else. The ergoline alkaloids, the chemical family to which both LSD and LSA belong, have a particular affinity for another class of receptor, entirely separate from the serotonin system: the alpha-adrenergic receptors. These are the receptors that regulate the smooth muscle walls of blood vessels, controlling their degree of contraction and relaxation. Ergot, the fungus from which Hofmann's entire research program had begun, had been known as a vasoconstrictor for centuries. It was the agent in contaminated rye bread that caused the extremity gangrene of St. Anthony's fire by cutting off blood supply to fingers and toes through intense and prolonged vascular contraction. The ergoline alkaloids, as a class, carry this vascular action within their structure. LSA activates both systems simultaneously. The 5-HT2A system opens the perceptual gate. The alpha-adrenergic system tightens the blood vessels. The effect of that combination on the body is what distinguishes the LSA experience from LSD in every account that has been recorded. The blood vessels in the periphery, the hands, the feet, the limbs, constrict. The muscles of the limbs become heavy, tense, prone to cramping. The legs, in particular, become sources of discomfort, dull aches, cramps, a feeling of weight and resistance that makes movement feel like wading through something thick. There is a pronounced sensitivity to cold. A flu-like quality arrives, not in the respiratory sense, but in the sense that the body presents itself as an obstacle rather than as a neutral container. Test subjects in the early clinical documentation described an unpleasant, flu-like feeling of illness settling over them 45 minutes after administration. Their facial expressions, observers noted, had changed as though they had suffered some kind of acute physical distress. This is not an abstract description. The face of someone on LSA in the early clinical records did not look like the face of someone having an interesting experience. It looked like the face of someone who was unwell. Add to this the nausea. LSA stimulates dopamine, D2 receptors in the chemoreceptor trigger zone, the area of the brain that, among other things, receives signals about whether the stomach's contents should be retained or expelled. The nausea associated with LSA is not a side effect in the way that a mild headache is a side effect. It is a direct pharmacological consequence of the molecule's action on this system. It arrives early. It can be severe. It does not always resolve before the perceptual effects begin, which means that a significant portion of the early LSA experience is spent in the company of both an opening of perception and a very insistent bodily complaint. The Aztec priests were not unintelligent people who happened to be consuming something unpleasant by accident. They knew what the seeds did. The grinding, the careful preparation, the controlled ritual setting, the specific posture and context of consumption. All of this was, among other things, a harm reduction protocol developed over generations of careful observation. The nighttime setting reduced visual stimulation in an environment where visual stimulation would amplify rather than anchor. The supine position addressed the motor impairment and cramping. The specific questions posed before consumption gave the altered state a structure to organize itself around, which may have reduced the anxiety that an entirely structureless perceptual disruption would produce. They had, without knowing any of the neuroscience, designed a container for an experience whose contours they understood empirically far better than any Western laboratory would understand them for the next 400 years. The duration of the LSA experience, 8 to 12 hours in the accounts that exist from clinical experiments and contemporary use, is longer than a typical LSD experience and considerably longer than psilocybin. The body load persists throughout. The vasoconstriction does not lift partway through the way nausea sometimes does. It accompanies the experience from onset to resolution, functioning as a continuous low-level physical tax on whatever the mind is doing in the meantime. The desire to lie still, to not move, to find a flat surface and simply remain on it, is not a psychological preference. It is a direct instruction from the body. The clinical notes from a 1956 study by Solms, documenting subjects given ergoline alkaloids, contain a passage that has the particular clarity of scientific language, describing something that the scientists themselves found uncomfortable to observe. Walking in the altered state was described as difficult due to leg cramps and slight incoordination. There was, the notes record, always a great desire to lie supine, always a great desire to lie supine. The language is dry. The image it produces is not. This is what the Aztec priest was experiencing in his mountain village on the night of a divination ceremony. This is what the compound inside those seeds does to a human body, whether that body belongs to a Teopixqui in pre-Columbian Oaxaca or a researcher in a mid-century Swiss clinic. The molecule does not adjust its behavior based on the century or the context. It activates the same receptors, initiates the same cascade of effects, produces the same heavy, downward, gravity-amplified state that every person who has documented the experience has described in their own language, but with the same essential content. What is remarkable, looking at the Aztec ritual from the vantage point of modern pharmacology, is not that they used this compound for spiritual contact. It is that they found a use for it at all. The experience is grinding, physically demanding, nauseating, and sedative. That a culture developed an elaborate institutional framework for using it productively, for navigating the specific character of the experience and extracting something useful from it, represents a level of empirical sophistication that the Spanish, in their urgency to identify the practice as demonic, entirely failed to notice. Hofmann noticed it. He was too precise, a scientist not to. His 1963 pharmacological description of LSA acknowledged, in the formal language of the paper, that the compound's properties were consistent with what the indigenous records described: the heavy sedation, the narcotic quality, the physical discomfort. All of it matched. The molecule and the ritual had been in perfect correspondence for centuries before the molecule had a name. By the end of the 1960s, the scientific understanding of LSA was reasonably well established. The compound existed. It was pharmacologically active. Its mechanism overlapped with, but was meaningfully distinct from, that of LSD. It was naturally present in the seeds of plants that had been growing in Mexico and in the gardens of suburban America for as long as those plants had been cultivated. And then, in 1970, the United States government sat down to decide what to do about it. What they produced was one of the strangest legal documents in the history of American drug policy. A decision that simultaneously controlled LSA and left every plant that contained it sitting freely on the garden center rack, available to anyone with a few dollars and no questions asked. The decision made a certain kind of internal sense. The consequences of it have never been formally addressed. They are still being felt today. The year 1970 arrived in America carrying the particular exhaustion of a decade that had tried to contain too many things at once. The assassinations of Kennedy and King and Kennedy again, the escalation in Vietnam and the photographs that had started coming back from it, the campus protests and the National Guard and the bodies at Kent State, and underneath all of it, a cultural argument about drugs that had been building in volume and urgency since the middle of the 1960s, when LSD had escaped the research laboratories and the psychiatric clinics and arrived in enormous quantities in the hands of young people who were using it in ways that nobody in authority had anticipated and nobody in authority was equipped to address. The political response to that argument was Richard Nixon, and Nixon's response to the drugs was the Controlled Substances Act. The act was signed into law on October 27, 1970. It was Title II of a larger piece of legislation, the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, and its ambition was sweeping in a way that only legislation produced at a moment of genuine institutional anxiety tends to be. What Congress wanted was consolidation. In the decades before 1970, American drug law had accumulated across multiple separate statutes, each addressing different substances under different regulatory frameworks, administered by different agencies, with different enforcement mechanisms and different penalties. The result was a patchwork of overlapping jurisdictions and inconsistent penalties that nobody, including the agencies tasked with enforcing it, found easy to navigate. The Controlled Substances Act was designed to replace all of that with a single unified system, 5 schedules, clear criteria for each, one federal framework. The criteria that determined which schedule a substance landed in was straightforward enough on paper. A substance's potential for abuse, its accepted medical use in treatment, and its likelihood of producing physical or psychological dependence. These three factors, weighed against each other, produced a schedule placement. Schedule 1, at the top, was reserved for substances with high abuse potential, no accepted medical use, and a significant risk of dependence. LSD went there, heroin went there, cannabis went there, a placement that even in 1970 struck many medical researchers as scientifically indefensible, but that was politically convenient in ways that overrode the science. Schedule 1 was not merely a legal classification. It was a statement, a declaration that the substance in question had no legitimate place in American life, and that the full power of federal enforcement would be brought to bear against anyone who interacted with it. LSA did not go to Schedule 1. LSA, lysergic acid amide, ergine, the compound that Albert Hofmann had found in the seeds of a morning glory vine growing in the mountains of Oaxaca, the substance that had been producing psychedelic experiences in human beings for at least 5 centuries before anyone had a name for it, was classified as Schedule 3, the middle tier, substances with moderate to low potential for abuse and dependence, and with accepted medical uses, the same schedule as ketamine, the same schedule as anabolic steroids, the same schedule as Tylenol with codeine. The distinction between Schedule 1 and Schedule 3 is not merely administrative, it is fundamental. A Schedule 1 substance has no legal pathway to possession, manufacture, or distribution outside of a DEA-licensed research context. It cannot be prescribed, it cannot be dispensed, it cannot be administered in a medical setting to a patient in the ordinary course of clinical practice. The research exemptions that exist are narrow, bureaucratically onerous, and in practice accessible only to institutional researchers with specific DEA registrations, a category that, in 1970 and for decades afterward, effectively meant a very small number of federally approved scientists working in a very small number of federally approved facilities. For everyone else, a Schedule 1 substance was simply prohibited. Full stop. No exceptions, no pathways, no gray areas. A Schedule 3 substance can, in principle, be prescribed. It can be administered in clinical settings. It can be manufactured and distributed by licensed companies. The penalties for trafficking a Schedule 3 substance, while real and significant, are a fraction of what they are for Schedule 1. The level of regulatory scrutiny applied to its production, storage, and distribution is meaningfully lower. And the implicit public statement that a Schedule 3 classification makes about a substance is entirely different from the statement that Schedule 1 makes. LSD, with no accepted medical use and a Schedule 1 classification, was in the same legal category as heroin. Possessing it without authorization was a serious federal crime. LSA, with its Schedule 3 classification, was in the same category as anabolic steroids, as ketamine, as Tylenol with codeine. Substances that the law regarded as requiring control, but not as requiring the most extreme form of control available. Substances that had a place in the regulated world, even if that place was carefully bounded. Why the difference? The simplest answer is that in 1970, LSA was not particularly well known. It was not LSD. It had not appeared on the front pages of newspapers or featured in the Senate testimony of anxious parents. It had not been associated with the counterculture in the way that LSD had. Not because it was less psychoactive in principle, but because it was harder to use, less reliably pleasant, and significantly less available in purified form. To get a psychedelic effect from LSA required either extracting it from seeds, a process that demanded some chemical knowledge and equipment, or simply consuming the seeds directly, which came with an experience that most people who tried it described as unpleasant enough in its body effects to discourage casual repetition. LSD, by contrast, was available in the mid-1960s in quantities that reflected serious underground production capacity, at a purity that made its effects reliable, at a dose so small that it could be dissolved into a glass of water or applied to a piece of paper and delivered invisibly. It had become a social problem in a way that was visible, measurable, politically charged, and demanded a governmental response. LSA was, from the perspective of the lawmakers drafting the Controlled Substances Act in 1969 and 1970, a pharmacological footnote, a compound that a small number of chemists knew about, that an even smaller number of people had used, that had no particular association in the public mind with disorder or danger, or the cultural anxieties that LSD had come to symbolize. It received a schedule placement that reflected its low public profile rather than any careful analysis of its actual pharmacological properties relative to the substances placed in Schedule 1. It was not put in Schedule 3 because the legislators had weighed it against LSD and found it meaningfully safer. It was put in Schedule 3 because it was not LSD, and because in 1970 that was essentially the entirety of the relevant political calculus. There is a second layer to this, and it matters more. The Controlled Substances Act, like all drug legislation that has ever been drafted in any jurisdiction anywhere in the world, was written to schedule compounds, not plants. The law deals in chemicals. It deals in molecules that can be named, isolated, synthesized, and quantified. The legal instrument is designed for substances that exist in purified, discrete form, the kind of substances that appear in a chemist's inventory, in a pharmaceutical company's production records, in the seized evidence bags of a DEA operation. It is not structurally well adapted to deal with the problem of a chemical that exists naturally inside a plant, that has an entirely legitimate and entirely separate existence as a garden ornamental. This structural limitation was not unique to LSA. It runs through American drug law, like a recurring architectural flaw, appearing in different contexts with different consequences, but always revealing the same underlying design problem. Cocaine is a scheduled substance. Coca leaves, the plant from which cocaine is derived, occupy a different and more complicated legal position, with certain limited quantities exempted from the cocaine scheduling in recognition of their traditional and ceremonial uses. Mescaline, the psychoactive compound in the peyote cactus, is a Schedule 1 substance. The peyote cactus itself carries a specific religious exemption for members of the Native American Church, who have used it ceremonially for centuries, because scheduling the plant directly would have raised constitutional issues around religious freedom that Congress was not prepared to confront in 1970. The compound is controlled. The plant navigates around the control through a different legal mechanism. The Morning Glory presented a version of this problem. LSA was scheduled. The Morning Glory was not. The seeds of the Morning Glory contain LSA in concentrations sufficient to produce full psychedelic effects in a person who consumes them in sufficient quantity. But the plant itself, Ipomoea tricolor, the species known in garden centers as heavenly blue, the award-winning climbing annual that the Royal Horticultural Society has given its Award of Garden Merit, the fast-growing ornamental vine that garden center catalogs describe as perfect for covering an unforgiving fence, has no scheduling. It has no controlled status. It is sold freely, in bulk, in paper seed packets hanging from metal display racks, sitting between the tomato seeds and the herb kits, available to anyone with a few dollars and no questions to answer. No age verification, no pharmacist, no locked cabinet, no warning on the packaging that the contents of this envelope are chemically related to a Schedule III controlled substance that would require a DEA registration to possess in its extracted form. Just a price tag. This gap between the extracted compound requires a federal license, and the plant is available for delivery by tomorrow morning with free shipping, is not an oversight in the way that a typographical error is an oversight. It is a structural feature of how the law was written, a consequence of the decision to schedule molecules rather than organisms, and it has never been formally addressed. The DEA has not moved to schedule the seeds. Congress has not amended the Controlled Substances Act to close the gap. In the more than 5 decades since the act was signed into law, the Morning Glory has continued to be sold in garden centers across America, and the LSA inside its seeds has continued to be a Schedule III controlled substance, and these two facts have coexisted without anyone in federal authority having issued a definitive statement about what, precisely, this means. The legal position, as it currently stands, is this: possessing the extracted compound without a DEA registration is a federal offense. Purchasing and possessing seeds of Ipomoea tricolor for ornamental gardening purposes is entirely legal. What happens in the space between those two positions, what the law says about the intent behind the purchase, about the distinction between ornamental and consumptive use, about the precise moment at which a legal seed becomes an illegal substance, has been left deliberately or accidentally or simply administratively unresolved. This is the moment to return to where this story began. The garden center on a Saturday morning, the man with the potting soil, the children pointing at the bright blooms, the family loading tomato plants into the trunk of a car, and on the metal rack near the entrance, in a paper packet with a small plastic price tag, the seeds of Ipomoea tricolor, heavenly blue morning glory, hanging between the marigold seeds and the sweet pea packets, in a place so ordinary and familiar and populated with the specific texture of suburban Saturday morning, that the words psychedelic compound and federal controlled substance seem momentarily like they belong to a different story altogether. They do not belong to a different story. They belong to this one. That packet of seeds contains, inside each of the dark, hard-coated seeds it holds, a symbiotic fungus called Periglandula ipomoea, that the vine has been hosting in its tissue since long before the first Europeans set foot in the Americas. That fungus produces ergoline alkaloids, the same chemical family that Albert Hofmann had spent his career working with, the same molecular scaffold that underlies both LSD and LSA, the same family of compounds that the Aztec priests were consuming in the mountains of Oaxaca when Francisco Hernandez arrived with his notebooks and his alarm and his meticulous attention to detail. The seeds on the rack in the garden center are, in a precise and unambiguous chemical sense, containers for a Schedule III controlled substance. Buying them requires nothing more than reaching out your hand, The man pushing the shopping cart past them does not know this. The children pointing at the flowers certainly do not know this. The garden center employee who restocked the rack this morning does not know this. Or if they do, it is not information that bears on their workday in any practical way. The seeds sit in their packets and do nothing. They are inert. They are decorative. They are the picture of suburban innocence. And the thing that makes them not innocent at all is invisible, contained inside the hard shell of each seed, waiting with the patience of a compound that has been waiting for a long time. Waiting through the Aztec Empire and the Spanish Conquest and the Inquisition and 4 centuries of colonial suppression and a Harvard botanist's field notebook and a Swiss chemist's laboratory bench and the signing of the Controlled Substances Act and the decades that followed it. The morning glory is still the most popular ornamental climbing vine sold in American garden centers. Heavenly blue, the variety whose seeds contain the highest concentrations of ergoline alkaloids among the commonly available cultivars, is described in seed catalogs as an heirloom vine that has been covering fences with its attractive foliage and cheerful flowers for decades. It has won awards. It is recommended by horticultural societies. It is bought by people who do not know what it contains, and occasionally by people who do, and the law has drawn no useful line between those two groups of buyers, because it has never quite managed to address the fact that both groups are walking out of the same garden center with the same packet in their hands. Some supermarkets and garden retailers have, quietly and individually, made the decision to stop carrying Ipomoea tricolor seeds. This is not a legal requirement. It is a private commercial decision made by individual companies that became aware of the gap between the compound scheduling and the plant's legality, and decided they would prefer not to be associated with the ambiguity that gap creates. Their decision does not represent any legal conclusion about the status of the seeds. It represents a corporate risk calculation, the reputational and regulatory exposure of being known as the retailer, whose seed rack supplies recreational psychedelic use, is not, in the judgment of those particular companies, worth the revenue from morning glory seed sales. The seeds are available elsewhere. The gap in the law remains. No federal court has definitively ruled on where the line falls between legal possession of ornamental seeds and illegal possession of a Schedule III controlled substance in the plant form. No federal agency has issued formal guidance. The DEA, as of the most recent publicly available documentation, has not moved to schedule the plant. Congress has not amended the Controlled Substances Act to address the situation. The gap that opened in 1970 when LSA was scheduled and its host plant was not, remains, in its essential form, intact. The rack remains stocked. The price tag remains visible. What the man with the shopping cart does not know, as he pushes past the metal rack on his way to the potting soil, is that he is walking past one of the longest running and most quietly persistent anomalies in American drug law, a legal opening that has existed, in essentially the same form, since 1970, an ornamental plant that is also a Schedule III drug delivery system. A cheerful climbing vine with azure blue trumpet flowers that has been winning horticultural awards and containing federally controlled ergoline alkaloids simultaneously, without anyone in a position of authority having yet decided to do anything about the tension between those two facts. He puts the potting soil in his cart. He picks up a pair of gardening gloves. He moves on. Behind him, the seeds hang in their packets on the metal rack. They have been there for a long time. They will probably continue to be there for some time yet. But the story of how they got there and what they contain and what the gap in the law that keeps them there actually means, that story has one more chapter. Because even if you know about the loophole, even if you understand exactly what sits on the shelf and exactly what it is, there is still something else standing between that seed packet and the ancient experience the Aztec priests sought inside it. Something added not by legislators, but by agronomists for reasons that have nothing to do with drug control at all, and everything to do with the mundane commercial logic of the seed industry. Something invisible, something that the packaging does not mention, something designed, in principle, to protect the seed from fungi, but which has a secondary effect on any human being who decides to consume what is inside the packet. The seeds on the rack are not always what they appear to be. They were not always what they appeared to be even before the fungus was understood. But what has been done to many of them in the decades since commercial seed production industrialized and standardized and globalized, has added a new dimension to the story, one that the Aztec priests could not have anticipated, one that Francisco Hernandez could not have documented, one that Albert Hofmann could not have predicted, and one that anyone who reaches for that packet in the garden center today might very much want to know about before they do anything with what they find inside. There is a practical problem that sits between the garden center rack and the ancient experience the Aztec priests sought inside those seeds. It is not a legal problem, though the legal problems are real enough. It is not a pharmacological problem in the way that the body load and the nausea are pharmacological problems. It is a problem that nobody who grew the morning glory in a suburban garden would have any reason to think about, because it concerns a substance applied to the outside of the seed before it went into the packet. A substance put there for reasons that have nothing to do with psychedelics, nothing to do with drug policy, and nothing to do with the centuries of history that brought the vine from the mountains of Oaxaca to a metal retail display rack in the first place. It is a fungicide, Thirum, tetramethylthiuram disulfide, to use its full chemical name, is a dithiocarbamate compound that has been used in commercial agriculture since the 1940s. It belongs to a class of non-systemic fungicides that are applied as a protective coating on seeds before packaging, with the purpose of preventing fungal infection during the critical germination window. When a seed sits in moist soil waiting to germinate, it is vulnerable to a range of soil-borne fungi that can destroy it before the seedling ever emerges. A fungicide coating applied to the seed's outer surface forms a chemical barrier against those pathogens. For the seed company, the benefit is straightforward. Treated seeds germinate more reliably, produce more consistent results across varying soil conditions, and generate fewer customer complaints about failed plantings. Thirum is one of the most widely used compounds for this purpose, applied to fruits, vegetables, ornamentals, and turf across the agricultural industry for decades. The EPA classifies it as a general-use pesticide with moderate to slight toxicity by most routes of exposure, and its application to ornamental seeds, including morning glory, is entirely standard, entirely legal, and entirely routine. It is also, when consumed directly by a human being, a compound with a documented toxicological profile that is worth understanding precisely. Acute exposure to Thirum, at the doses that might be encountered if someone consumed seeds coated with it, can produce headaches, dizziness, fatigue, nausea, diarrhea, and a broader range of gastrointestinal complaints. These are not theoretical effects derived from animal studies at extreme doses. They are the documented effects of therum ingestion in humans. The EPA's own fact sheet on the compound identifies it as a neurotoxicant, capable of producing lethargy and reduced motor activity. Its structural similarity to disulfiram, the compound used in antabus, the alcohol aversion medication, means that therum interacts badly with alcohol. Consuming therum and then consuming alcohol produces a reaction that is genuinely unpleasant. The body is unable to process acetaldehyde normally, which accumulates in the bloodstream and produces flushing, nausea, palpitations, and a general experience of acute physical distress. The warning on therum's professional-grade product documentation is explicit on this point. No alcohol on any day when therum is encountered and for a significant period afterward. The EPA also identifies therum as a developmental toxicant. Animal studies have documented severe fetal malformations at relevant doses, fused ribs, underdeveloped skeletal structures, cardiac abnormalities. It is listed by the European Union as a Category 1 potential endocrine disruptor. These are not the properties of a compound that was designed to be consumed by anyone. Therum is designed to be applied to a seed that will be planted in soil, watered, and allowed to germinate. The seed is not intended to go anywhere near a human digestive system. The label on treated seed products is required to say as much. Treated seed must not be used for or mixed with food or animal feed. The instruction is there because the regulation requires it, not because anyone thought that ornamental garden seeds needed to be explicitly distinguished from food. But here is the thing about that instruction and that label. It is not on the consumer seed packet, hanging from the metal rack in the garden center. The treated seed label requirements apply to bulk agricultural seed sold through agricultural channels. Consumer-facing retail seed packets. The paper packets with the picture of the blue flowers on the front are not required to state that the seeds inside have been treated, what they have been treated with, or what the consequences of consuming them might be. The packaging might say, as the Ipomoya Tricolor Gardening entries note, that ingestion may cause severe discomfort. It might say the plant is toxic to dogs and cats. What it will not say, because no regulation requires it and no seed company has volunteered to include it, is that a proportion of the discomfort experienced by a person who consumes those seeds may be caused not by the ancient ergoline alkaloids that the Aztec priests worked with for centuries, but by the industrial chemical coating that was applied to the seed in a processing facility, and that was not there when Francisco Hernandez described the plant in 1570. The significance of this goes directly to the experience of anyone who consumes commercial morning glory seeds, expecting something resembling what the historical sources describe. Consider the practical reality. A person reaches for a packet of heavenly blue morning glory seeds at a garden center. The packet weighs almost nothing. The price is low. The seeds inside are dense and dark and hard-coated, which is simply the natural structure of the Ipomoya seed. A tough outer shell that, in the wild, requires weathering and scarification before germination can begin, and which, in the gardening context, seed companies recommend nicking or soaking overnight to speed the process. There is nothing on the packet's exterior that indicates chemical treatment. There is nothing that explains the compound class of the treatment, its toxicological profile, or the fact that one of its known acute effects in humans is the same category of gastrointestinal distress that the seeds themselves produce through an entirely separate pharmacological mechanism. The packet is a packet of flower seeds. It looks exactly like every other packet of flower seeds on the rack beside it. The nausea associated with morning glory seeds has always had two possible sources. The first is pharmacological, LSA, and the other ergoline alkaloids in the seeds stimulate dopamine, D2 receptors in the chemoreceptor trigger zone, producing nausea as a direct neurological consequence of the compound's action on the brain. This is the nausea that the Aztec priests experienced. It is inherent to the molecule. The second source is entirely external to the molecule. It is the fungicide coating, producing its own gastrointestinal effects through a completely separate mechanism, layered on top of the inherent nausea of the compound itself. A person consuming commercial seeds is not necessarily consuming only what the historical sources describe. They are consuming what the historical sources describe, plus whatever the seed company applied to the outside of the seed before putting it in the packet. This distinction matters because it is invisible. There is no way to determine by looking at a morning glory seed whether it has been treated with thiram or captan, another fungicide commonly applied to ornamental seeds, which produces its own gastrointestinal irritation on direct consumption, or with any other protective compound. The seed looks the same. The packet looks the same. The only reliable way to avoid consuming treated seeds is to source seeds that are specifically and verifiably untreated, which means sourcing them from suppliers who cater explicitly to the organic gardening market, or from suppliers who have become aware that a portion of their customer base has specific reasons to want seeds in their unmodified natural state and have positioned themselves accordingly. These suppliers exist. Untreated morning glory seeds are commercially available, sold openly online, accessible to anyone who takes the time to look. The legal status of those seeds: to be planted ornamentally, not to be consumed for any other purpose, is the same as the status of the treated seeds on the garden center rack. The contemporary landscape of morning glory seed use, to the extent that it can be mapped at all, exists largely in the spaces that the internet created. Harm reduction communities, where people who have consumed the seeds document their experiences with the kind of clinical precision that emerges when the alternative is no information at all. These accounts are not recruitment material. They are, on the whole, cautionary in tone, detailed descriptions of the body load, the duration, the difficulty of managing the physical discomfort alongside the perceptual effects, the importance of sourcing verified untreated seeds, the difference between an experience that is navigable and one that becomes, through the combination of fungicide and alkaloids and inexperience, and an unsuitable setting, genuinely frightening. The people writing these accounts are attempting to do with the resources available to them in the 21st century, something that the Aztec priests accomplished through centuries of institutional knowledge. Build a container for an experience whose contours they understand imperfectly, in the absence of any traditional framework that might have told them what to expect. What those harm reduction communities cannot provide, and what no amount of internet documentation can substitute for, is the institutional context that the Teopixqui carried. The specific questions, the nighttime setting, the particular preparation of the seeds, the presence of an experienced practitioner who had navigated this territory before, and whose role was not to have the experience alongside the person, but to hold the structure within which the experience could be meaningful, rather than merely intense. The Aztec ritual was not just a drug consumption event. It was a technology for managing a specific pharmacological process in service of a specific outcome. The container was as much the ritual as the seed. The vine has, in this regard, navigated the modern world with the same quiet persistence it has always displayed. Every obstacle that has been placed in its path, the Spanish Inquisition, the burning of codices, 4 centuries of colonial suppression, the Controlled Substances Act, the industrial application of agricultural chemicals, has redirected the practice rather than ended it. The seeds are still there. The alkaloids are still inside them. The relationship between the plant and the human being who chooses to seek that relationship out has been made more complicated, more treacherous, more surrounded by hazards that earlier eras did not have to navigate. But it has not been severed, and in the mountains of Oaxaca, it was never complicated at all. The Mazatec community in the Sierra Mazateca, the same high mountain territory that sheltered the practice through the Spanish Conquest, the Inquisition, and 400 years of colonial and post-colonial pressure, still uses the seeds. This is not a statement about cultural preservation in the abstract, not a reference to ceremonial activities conducted as historical reenactment or spiritual tourism or ethnobotanical documentation. It is a description of ongoing practice, continuous and unbroken, embedded in the medical and spiritual life of the community in the same way it has always been embedded. Mazatec healers, curanderos and curanderas, who inherit and transmit a tradition of knowledge about the plants of the Sierra Mazateca that has accumulated across generations, use morning glory seeds, psilocybin mushrooms, and salvia divinorum as instruments of their practice. The seeds in this context are known as semillas de la Virgen, the seeds of the Virgin, a name that reflects the Catholic language adopted over the colonial period and layered over a practice whose origins predate Christianity in the Americas by centuries. The renaming is not an abandonment of the tradition. It is a continuation of the same adaptive strategy that kept the tradition alive through every attempt to eradicate it. In the villages of the Sierra Mazateca, health problems are addressed through a system that does not neatly map onto the Western distinction between physical medicine and spiritual practice. A healer receives a person who is sick or troubled, or in need of the kind of knowledge that ordinary waking consciousness cannot access. The healer uses the appropriate plant for the situation. Sometimes it is the mushrooms, sometimes it is the sage, sometimes it is the seeds. The same round, unremarkable brown seeds that Hernandez described in 1570, that Schultes found in living ceremonial use in 1937, that Hofmann received in a package from Mexico in 1959, and analyzed in his Sandoz laboratory, with results that surprised even him. The community does not experience this as the continuation of something ancient. It experiences it as the continuation of something simply present, a resource, a relationship, a practice that has always been there, and that the Mazatec people have always maintained on their own terms. Tonight, as this story is being told and heard, there are communities in the mountains of southern Mexico for whom the vine is not a historical artifact, not a pharmacological curiosity, not a legal loophole, not a footnote in the Controlled Substances Act. It is medicine. It is technology. It is the instrument through which a healer approaches the questions that ordinary means cannot answer. The gap between what sits on a retail rack in suburban America and what grows on a hillside in Oaxaca, the gap between the heavenly blue seed packet and the seeds of the Virgin, is not a gap in the plant. The plant is the same. The gap is everything that has been layered onto it, and around it and over it by the 5 centuries of history that separate the world it came from and the world it now exists in. That gap is the whole of this story. Consider what it contains, and what it means that all of these things can coexist simultaneously in the same story, attached to the same plant, visible on the same metal rack in the same garden center. A civilization's approach to the boundary between the human world and whatever exists beyond it. An approach that was systematic, institutionalized, empirically refined over generations, and organized around the specific pharmacological properties of a compound that those people understood experientially, with a precision that Western science would not match until 1960. A conquest that tried to erase that approach through violence, legal prohibition, and the systematic destruction of its institutional infrastructure. The extraordinary stubbornness of a plant that could not be unmade because it was not made. It grew, and it grew back, and it continued to grow. A Harvard botanist who arrived in the mountains in 1937 with a PhD project and found a living tradition that no amount of colonial suppression had managed to extinguish. A Swiss chemist who discovered in a laboratory in Basel that had never heard of ololiuqui, that the molecule at the center of his life's work had been growing in a vine in Mexico for longer than Switzerland had existed as a nation. A government that scheduled the compound in 1970 and left the plant on the rack. A seed industry that applied an industrial fungicide to the outside of seeds containing that compound, for reasons entirely unrelated to any of this, and in doing so added a new hazard to an experience that already had plenty. And through all of it, the mountains of Oaxaca, the mountain communities, the continuity of transmission that survived every attempt to break it. The morning glory is still the most popular ornamental climbing vine in American retail. Heavenly Blue still wins horticultural awards. The rack in the garden center is still stocked for the spring planting season, and the families who walk past it on Saturday mornings are still, almost all of them, entirely unaware of what they are walking past. The man with the shopping cart has reached the potting soil. He lifts the bag with both hands and places it in the cart. He doesn't look back at the seed rack. There's no reason to. It's just flowers. He doesn't know what Albert Hofmann felt when he opened those seeds in a Swiss laboratory and found something that should not have been there. He doesn't know the name Francisco Hernandez or what happened to his manuscripts after he carried them back to Spain. He doesn't know about the Teopixqui in the mountains of Oaxaca, who ground those same seeds in a stone mortar on the night before something important needed to be known. He doesn't know that the seeds on that rack and the seeds in those mountains are chemically, botanically, and historically the same thing, that the distance between the metal display stand and the ceremony in the Sierra Mazateca is 5 centuries of layered history and absolutely zero botany. He puts a pair of gardening gloves in the cart. He moves on toward the checkout. The morning glory seeds hang in their packets on the rack. The rack stands in the morning light, the same light that falls on the lawnmowers and the potting soil and the tomato seedlings in their trays and everything else in the outdoor section of a garden center on a Saturday morning in suburban America, which is to say, ordinary light, unselective light, the kind that makes no distinctions between what it illuminates. The distinction is inside the seed, It has always been inside the seed. The Aztec priests who ground it knew what was there. Hernandez, who described it, suspected what was there. Schultes, who collected it, understood, partially, what was there. Hofmann, who analyzed it, knew precisely what was there and found it improbable. The DEA that scheduled it controlled what was there while leaving the container legally available. The seed company that coated it added something new to what was there without any intention of engaging with the rest of the history. What is there in each of those dark, hard, unremarkable seeds is a compound that belongs to one of the most significant chemical families in the history of pharmacology. Inside a plant that belongs to one of the most significant botanical histories in the relationship between human beings and the non-human world, sitting on a rack in the most ordinary place imaginable. It has always been there. It will probably be there for a long time yet. Some things hide in plain sight, not because they are clever at hiding, but because the world around them has decided, for reasons of its own, not to look. Good night.